In this podcast, we're going to go over how to name covalent compounds. Before we go over some example problems, let's first talk about how to name a covalent compound. So remember that when we are working with covalent compounds, we are talking about two nonmetals. In a covalent compound, we will use prefixes. The prefixes tell us how many of a certain atom we have, so they are equivalent to the subscript. When we name these, we will use a prefix in front of the first nonmetal, and we will not change the name of that nonmetal, so we'll give it exactly as it's written on the periodic table. But for the second nonmetal, we will again use a prefix, but we will change the ending of that nonmetal. So we will change the ending to IDE. So if we had chlorine, we would change that to chloride. If we had nitrogen, we'd change it to nitride. The only other thing to keep in mind is that for the first nonmetal, we will use every prefix shown here except for mono. We never put mono on the first one. Okay, so first thing I want to do, and this is just a good habit to get into, is to identify that I am indeed working with two nonmetals. Carbon is a nonmetal and chlorine is a nonmetal. So I know I'm going to use prefixes and name this covalently. So for the first nonmetal, I don't change the name at all. It is still carbon. And if you don't see any number down here in the subscript, we can assume that there's one of those carbons. However, for the first nonmetal, we never write mono. We simply leave it blank. So we will not put a prefix for this. If it were 2 or 3 or 4, we would use the prefixes, but not in this case. The second nonmetal is chlorine, and I have 4 of those chlorines. So I'm going to start with the prefix tetra, and I'm going to change the ending of chlorine to chloride. So this molecule would be named carbon tetrachloride. Again, keep in mind I don't put mono on the first. If I only had one on the second, I would put that there. All right, in our next example, I'm going to start by just verifying that we indeed have a covalent compound. Sulfur is a nonmetal and fluorine is a nonmetal, looking at my periodic table. So I'm going to start by looking at the subscript on my first nonmetal. There is no number. Again, we assume if there's no number that we have 1. However, we do not write mono on the first element. So I'm simply going to write sulfur for this one. Looking at the prefix or the subscript to figure out the prefix for fluorine, it is 6. The prefix for 6 is hexa. And I'm going to change the name fluorine with an INE to fluoride. So this molecule would be named sulfur hexafluoride. All right, in our last example, we are again going to verify that we are working with a covalent compound, so we know how to name it. Nitrogen is a nonmetal and oxygen is a nonmetal, so I'm good to go, and I'm going to use prefixes to denote my subscript. So looking at our compound, we have 2 nitrogens. So again, this is above 1, so I am going to write this with the prefix di for 2, and I'm going to write out the word nitrogen. I'm not going to change the ending because it is the first nonmetal. So this would be dinitrogen. Looking at the subscript for oxygen, I notice that there's 3. The prefix for 3 is tri, and I'm going to change the name oxygen to oxide as I change the ending in my second element. So N2O3 is dinitrogen trioxide.